Until now, the captain had said. Joe's mind was still trying to process the fact he was not about to be cast out an airlock. Lan looked from her friend's anguished face to the captain and back, trying to process everything. It was Joe's dad that spoke first. What do you mean? Until now? He sounded confused. Captain Oliver then began to explain. This message the boy found, if it's legitimate, is the message that gets sent out when a Starship hull has successfully been created. The last one to be sent was almost 100 years ago. In the intervening time, people had given up on the old processing ships having either survived or of them having found enough raw materials to create another hull. I doubt there are more than a handful of people listening for these messages anymore. Most of them are considered crackpots. What do you mean, if it's legitimate? Rafi asked. A few times in our history, con men and scam artists have used false completion messages to convince investors that they had the location of the next Starship and use that to cheat people out of millions. Even though it's been decades, it's prudent to check this out first. But if it's real, this from the plant manager, he paused, his mind working. If it's real, Captain Oliver said, then we'd better hurry up and find it. Now he looked at Joe. When did you first see this message? A few days before you arrived on my grandpa's old gear he gave me. Joe answered. I saved the message in the memory. He added, uncertain. You did? Excellent. The captain's personality seems to have changed. Where before he seemed introverted and sad, he was now excited, he face bright with a smile. Joe marveled at the change that seemed to come over Captain Oliver now. I'd like to see this old gear of your grandpa's. Captain Oliver was openly grinning now. Joe looked to his dad, Rafi, still uncertain about the whole thing. He shrugged. Why not? You can stay for dinner. Joe was now certain he was dreaming. This sort of thing simply didn't happen. He was right, of course, but here it was. As they left the ship, Joe's dad messaged his mom, telling her that they had an impromptu dinner party coming. He would pick something up on the way home. After an elbow to the ribs and a pleading look from her, Joe also asked if Lon could come too, which his father agreed to. Stephen, Rafi's boss, paused and looked at his wrist pad. I should be getting home. It seems it's been an interesting day. He smiled, not quite warmly. They said their goodbyes, the captain warned Stephen, and all of them to tell no one a thing about what they had seen or thought they had seen. After a short stop at the station's stores to pick up enough food, which Captain Oliver insisted on paying for, they came to Joe's door. When the door opened, his mother was slightly surprised to see 4 of them, along with a large package of foodstuffs. She looked at this, and then at her husband. Captain Oliver noticed and explained. Since you're gracious enough to host me, I thought it the least I could do to replenish your pantry after all. Thank you, she replied. That's very kind. Joe's dad spoke up next. I should introduce our guests, I suppose. Anne, this is Lan, Joe's friend. He paused, and Anne looked at Lan, who smiled and nodded. Nice to meet you, ma'am. And this, he paused again, and Captain Oliver spoke up. Captain James Oliver of the Sundancer, pleased to meet you, ma'am. Please call me James. He smiled and bowed slightly. Joe's mother was momentarily silent. Her eyes went wide, then narrowed. She looked at her husband. Oh, you had me for a second, she said, as if you'd be bringing home an actual... Her words trailed away. Everyone was looking at her. Captain Oliver was still smiling politely, while her husband was nodding slowly, as if to help her thought process along. Joe spoke up. Mom, he really is from the Sundancer. Lon nodded. This independent confirmation seemed to convince Anne that she had an actual celebrity guest in her apartment. Anne's face went through a series of expressions. To cut off the awkward moment, Rafi asked, Anne, why don't we let our guests have a seat and we can put some of this food together? She recovered quickly. Yes, of course, please sit and relax. Would anyone like a drink? No? Oh, well, please make yourselves comfortable then. We'll be just over there in the kitchen if you need anything." As they walked away, Joe heard his mother whispering to his father, "Why didn't you tell me you were bringing him home? I'm not even dressed or anything." She was still wearing her work scrubs, which Joe never thought twice about. He always thought his mom looked fine. "I did tell you I was bringing home some important guests," Rafi answered. "Yes, but really?" She was at a loss. They both quickly became absorbed in preparing the food that they had brought with them. When she opened the packages, her eyes got very wide. "Izrenya, Rafi, как вы могли? We can't afford this. Real meat and cheese?" She was horrified at the expense. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am," Captain Oliver said. "I insisted on paying, and so I took the liberty of also ordering as well." I hope I didn't overstep. He did look apologetic, but he was more concerned that he'd embarrassed his hosts with his extravagance than whether the food choices bothered them. He was pretty sure things that had to be imported from Earth or Luna were rare treats for a family on a modest income, and he had over 100 years back pay with interest saved up. "Oh, you're very kind, Captain," Anne said, and relaxed a bit. The captain had been right, and having a chance to enjoy these out-of-reach items had soothed over some of the initial shock. Captain Oliver looked to Joe. "So, let's take a look at your find, shall we?" Joe had a sudden sinking feeling, remembering what his room looked like, and the fact that he was having a Starship captain and Lon in to see it in that condition. He nearly panicked. I need just a minute first," he threw over his shoulder as he sprinted to his room. He quickly shut the door and began shoving laundry under the bed, along with a couple dirty plates, straightening books and moving some of the larger items into his closet. Order and while Joe was engaged in his high-speed house cleaning, his brother Benny came out of his room where he'd been sleeping. He walked into the living room to see Stephen, whom he knew, along with Lan and Captain Oliver. He was closest to Lan, who he asked, "Who are you?" She replied, "You must be Joe's little brother, Benny." "My name is Lan, short for Svetlana." "A very pretty name," the captain said, causing Lan to turn a little pink. "Oh, you're Joe's girlfriend," Benny said, and the way he said girlfriend sent him into a fit of giggles. Lan's face turned a shade darker. "No, we're just friends," she began, but was cut off by Joe's mom. "Benny, you behave. We have guests." With this, Benny looked at the captain in his old-fashioned uniform with the many patches. "Who are you?" he asked. "Captain James Oliver of the Sun Dancer." The captain added a small formal bow, the grin on his face friendly and sincere. Benny looked him over, thinking. Finally, he said, "No, you're not." The captain looked bemused and asked, "What do you mean?" "You're not old." He drew out the word old to emphasize it. "My dad says Starship captains are really, really old. Like 1,000 years, you look younger than Dad." The captain looked amused. "Well, we haven't even had starships that long, so no one's that old. Still, by your time frame, I'm somewhere over 200 years old. But to my time frame, I'll be just turning 30 in a month or so." Benny's disbelief was obvious. "Here." The captain pulled out a worn leather wallet and removed an ID chit from it. "Can you read?" he asked. When Benny nodded affirmative, he said, "Look where it says date of birth on it." Benny's eyes widened. He couldn't do the 4-digit sums in his head, but he knew there was a big differences between today and the date on the chit. "Whoa!" Benny was a believer. He was about to begin asking all the questions that had suddenly appeared in his head when Joe returned, a little out of breath, but ready to show the captain and Lan what he'd seen and heard on the old comm gear in his room. At his invitation, they went to his room. The captain looked first to the shelf with the models. "Ah, I see you have built the Crimson Dart, Verdant Sun, and here the Sun Dancer." He looked at the model of his ship for a moment. "I see this is an older configuration. We changed out that high-gain antenna the trip before last," he said. He paused a moment, realizing that was over 40 years ago for his hosts. Joe explained, "I can only get the models that they stock on the stations. Some are pretty old. Now that I've seen her up close, I'll update the model." "Oh, don't," said the captain. "I like her that way. You did a fine job with her." At this last comment, Joe visibly puffed a little with pride. "Now, let's see your grandpa's radio, shall we?" They stepped over to the desk. Joe noticed that Lan was looking around his room in an odd sort of way. He noticed she had seen a bit of laundry poking out from under the bed. He quickly crossed over and tried to surreptitiously kick it further under. The gear's right here," he pointed. The captain and Lan began to look at it with interest, much to his relief. "It's the same model as on my ship, or very close," the captain began. "All the comm gear of that time period was designed to monitor the frequencies used by the processing ships that were sent out to make the Starship hulls. Everyone wanted to know when one was completed, most often to race to it to claim it as their own." His face darkened slightly with old memories. Over time, when no more of the signals came, people lost interest. Also, the newer communications channels were set off on higher frequencies for more efficient communications. The newer equipment simply evolved beyond the ability to hear the old frequencies. Besides you and me, I doubt anyone outside of a couple museums on Earth even have this gear anymore. He reached up and pressed the yellow marker on the display. The screen went blank, and then the text scrolled across it. "Celestron processor. Sends Azure Flame completed location Sol. 1578.2259. AU inclination 33.738. Declination 179.224. Orbital vectors 225.79 by 3759.25. At this, the captain held up the small data pad on his wrist to the port on the comm gear. He pressed another indicator. A small twirling circle appeared, indicating data transfer, then disappeared. "There, got you," he said. "What does that mean?" Lan asked. The captain looked at her, and then to the screen. "This first part is the name of the factory ship that built the hull. This one was the Celestron, probably named for a corporation that built it. Azure Flame is the name of the ship, though at this point she's just an empty hull, with no internals. The rest are a set of coordinates and direction vectors that provide a starting point and general direction of the orbit the ship was in at the time the message was sent." He looked thoughtfully at the numbers on the screen. "Except this can't be right. This first set of numbers, SOL 1578.2259 AU, is the distance from the sun, but that distance is outside the solar system. These ships were all sent to the asteroid belt and never went further than Jupiter's Trojan asteroids." "Trojan asteroids?" Lan asked. "Yes. There are two groups of asteroids that orbit along with Jupiter, the Greeks in front and the Trojans behind. The processor ships were programmed to search out various raw materials in the asteroid belt. When they couldn't find any, one or two of them went as far as those asteroids around Jupiter. None have ever gone further, at least none that we know of." He seemed thoughtful. This revelation put a bit of a damper on the excitement. They returned to the common room where the food had been laid out. As they sat and ate, Captain Oliver filled in the adults on what they had discovered. "So you think this transmission is a hoax after all?" Joe's father asked. "It looks like it," but the captain was thoughtful. "Still, it's easy enough to verify, I suppose." "How?" Joe asked. "Well, tonight when I go back to my ship, I'll look through the database and see if there was ever a processing ship called the Celestron launched, what the dates were, and if its final disposition was known." He looked at Joe. "How big is this station?" "About 5 kilometers across," Joe answered. "Good. Does the direction indicator work on your gear?" he asked. Joe nodded. "Excellent. So tomorrow we'll measure the direction to the source from here, then we'll bring the gear across the station. If the angle remains almost exactly the same, the signal source is very far away. If we can get a good enough measurement, we can compute a rough distance. We just need to prove it's not inside the orbit of Mars. He paused and looked at the faces in the room. If there was a ship named Celestron, and if she was launched long enough ago to make that trip, and if the angles don't change, then we may have a real message. That's a lot of ifs, Lon observed. Indeed, replied the captain. End of part 4.